I'm Courtney. It was Christmas night, and I stepped into a house bathed in warm lights, filled with polished dishes, and echoing with that fake laughter that only surfaces when people are putting on a show of happiness. Before I could fully enter the living room, my younger brother Ethan slung an arm around his girlfriend, Ava, and with that smug smile he'd perfected over the years, he declared, "This is the failure of our family." The room erupted in laughter so quickly it seemed rehearsed. My father laughed first, followed by my stepmother. Even the strangers in the room smiled politely, as if cruelty was just another Christmas tradition in this house. I stood there, holding a serving tray and still wearing the apron my stepmother had thrust into my hands as soon as I walked in. For a brief moment, I felt nothing. No anger, no shame, not even surprise. Just a cold silence that I'd unknowingly built up over the years. I set the tray down, reached into my pocket, and sent a pre-planned message. I didn't defend myself, argue, or remind them of all they didn't know. I just waited. Less than 5 minutes later, Ethan's phone rang. He answered with a grin that faded as he listened to the voice on the other end. By the time he pulled the phone away from his ear, his face had gone pale. For the first time in my life, the room fell silent for me. But this Christmas dinner wasn't just a one-time event. It was the culmination of years of pain and injustice. My life was different when my mother was alive. I was 15 then, and our home was a haven. She would tuck little notes in my lunch bag and massage my shoulders when I studied late. But cancer took her away from us quickly and brutally. One year, I had a loving mother. The next, I was standing in a black dress beside her casket, listening to adults tell me I was strong, which really meant I wasn't allowed to fall apart in front of them. My father didn't stay alone for long. 6 months later, he remarried a woman named Victoria. She had perfectly manicured nails, a bright smile, and a way of speaking that sounded sweet at first but always had a hidden barb. She moved into our house with new curtains, scented candles, and her son, Ethan, who was 3 years younger than me. From the moment they arrived, Ethan was treated like the center of the universe. Ethan was loud, athletic, and charming when he wanted to be. He had an uncanny ability to sense what people wanted from him and become that version of himself. My father lit up around him, a sight I hadn't seen since before my mother got sick. Suddenly, the house had a new rhythm. Ethan had soccer camp, new cleats, and elaborate birthday parties with rented inflatables. Whenever he made a mistake, he had a million excuses. Meanwhile, I was stuck with chores, hand-me-down clothes from church donations, and lectures about my attitude. If I dared to ask why Ethan never had to clear his plate, Victoria would watch him run through the kitchen in muddy shoes and laugh, saying boys were naturally wild. Then she'd turn to me and say, "Courtney, you're the girl in this house. Act like it." It was like a sacred ritual that no one was allowed to question. At first, I tried so hard. I was helpful, quiet, and tried to make myself useful, hoping my father would remember I was his daughter too. But my usefulness became my prison. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, and cleaned the house when relatives visited, while Ethan sat in the living room, chatting about soccer stats with my father as if they were best friends. Every time I looked up, Ethan was getting things I was told I didn't deserve. A new phone, a school trip, money for a team fundraiser. Victoria called him gifted, and my father called him a natural leader. When I asked to join an after-school art program, Victoria barely glanced at the flyer and asked, "Who will help me here if you're off drawing pictures?" My father, instead of saying no directly, would sigh and say, "Not now, Courtney. Ethan has a lot going on this season." It was as if my life had to constantly make way for his. At dinner, the best cuts of meat always ended up on Ethan's plate. On Christmas mornings, he opened more and bigger gifts, while I learned to feign gratitude for scarves, notebooks, and practical items. Victoria loved to praise Ethan in front of others. She'd say, "Ethan is going to do great things one day," and then glance at me and add, "Courtney is still finding herself." It became the family narrative. Ethan was the promise, I was the delay. As I got older, I learned to make myself smaller at the dinner table, softer in conversation, and easier to overlook. This was how we maintained peace in the house. Ethan shone brighter, and I faded into the background. The worst part wasn't that they favored him, it was that they needed me to be the comparison that made him look better. When I was 17, my school counselor told me I had a strong portfolio for a state summer art program. It was competitive, but she said I had a real chance. I went home excited, but when I showed my father and Victoria the application, they shot it down. The program dates overlapped with Ethan's regional soccer camp, and they said they couldn't split the budget or be in two places at once. Ethan's future was important, they said, and I could do art anytime. This pattern repeated itself. Ethan got driving lessons in a new car because he needed confidence on the road, while I took the bus to learn responsibility. He got tutoring before finals because pressure affected athletes, and I was told to study at the kitchen table after doing the dishes. On his 19th birthday, my father gave him tickets to a big soccer game and a fancy watch. That same year, when I asked to replace my dying laptop for my design assignments and college applications, Victoria told me to use the public library more often and not rely on convenience. Ethan understood the family dynamic early on. He could say anything to me as long as he smiled afterward in front of friends. He'd introduce me with little jokes like, "This is my sister Courtney. She's into artsy stuff and still trying to figure life out." People laughed because he was handsome and charming, and family cruelty was often masked by his charisma. I didn't fight back as often as I should have. Not because I was weak, but because no one in that house ever rewarded the truth. They rewarded the version of reality that made Ethan look good and everyone else comfortable. The more he was praised, the more casually cruel he became. He'd talk about how some people were built for pressure while others weren't, and my father never stopped him. Victoria would sometimes say, "Ethan, be nice," but it was as meaningless as a comment about the weather. I started to believe that love was something I had to earn by outperforming Ethan. I thought if I were more impressive, my father would finally see me. But our home didn't work that way. They didn't want me to rise, they wanted me to stay wounded to maintain the hierarchy. When I received my acceptance letter from a state university's design and communications program with a partial scholarship, I was overjoyed. I knew not to expect a big celebration, but I still hoped for some sign of pride. My father read the letter, nodded, and asked if the scholarship covered housing. When I said it didn't fully, he and Victoria exchanged a look. Ethan had just gotten into a private university on a sports-related admission track, and they'd already decided where the money would go. They told me it was a great opportunity to learn independence, and it made more sense to invest in Ethan where the return would be higher. I adjusted. I enrolled in the university, found a cheap room near a bus line, and got a part-time job at a coffee shop and weekend shifts at a diner. I told myself it was temporary, that hardship would build character. But college was tough. The early bus rides, long shifts that left my feet aching during lectures, and group projects with classmates whose parents paid for everything while I counted quarters for laundry took a toll. Halfway through my second semester, my housing situation fell apart when the landlord sold the property. I had 30 days to move, little savings, and a heavy class load. I called my father, hoping to come home for a few months. Instead, he asked if I'd considered that college wasn't the right fit for me. Victoria got on the phone and said pushing myself into overwhelming situations was stubborn. She said Ethan was built for high-pressure paths, and I was better off with a simpler life. 2 weeks later, I withdrew from college. I packed my clothes in trash bags and moved into a tiny apartment above a 24-hour diner. The place smelled of old grease and detergent, and the mattress was lopsided, but it was all I could afford. Ethan texted me that night, saying he knew I'd drop out eventually and told me not to make it a pity party. But something in me didn't die in that apartment. I decided to take control of my life. I had no degree, no family support, but I had anger, talent, and a high tolerance for hard work. I started taking small design jobs. I designed a logo for a local pizza place, made flyers for a mobile car detailing service, and built a social media package for a beauty salon. Every job taught me something, and I spent nights learning about branding, digital marketing, and analytics from free online tutorials and library books. One of my first big wins was with a family-owned Italian restaurant downtown. Their food was amazing, but their online presence was outdated. I offered them a low-cost rebrand package, and within 2 months, their weekend sales skyrocketed. The owner hugged me and cried in the parking lot. Word spread, and I started getting more clients, including a sports equipment store, a yoga studio, and a construction company. Around this time, I met Ryan through a referral. He was calm under pressure, strategic, and good at spotting talent in people who were often underestimated. He'd spent years in brand management and was leaving an agency that no longer suited him. Our first meeting was supposed to be 45 minutes, but we ended up talking for almost 3 hours, scribbling ideas on coffee shop napkins. Over the next year, we worked on projects together, and eventually, we launched Zenith Creative Group. Ryan was the public-facing CEO because he liked being in the spotlight, while I built the systems, strategies, and workflows. Since most of the initial capital came from my clients and I reinvested all the profits instead of paying myself well, I became the majority shareholder. At family gatherings, when anyone asked what I did, my father would say, "Courtney does some freelance design work." He made it sound like a temporary, unimportant job. Ethan had graduated by then and walked around with an air of confidence, talking about networking, brand building, and leadership as if he'd invented these concepts. Victoria would brag about his career to relatives as if it were a national achievement. They all assumed I was still lost because I wasn't loud. One day, Ethan applied for a mid-level brand strategy position at Zenith. Ryan handled the interview process. When I saw his name on the candidate list, I sat back and thought about all the years of pain and injustice. Ryan asked if I wanted to reject him immediately, but I said no. I wanted to see what would happen when he entered a space where my rules, not my father's excuses, applied. Ethan started at Zenith as if he were a star executive. He wore crisp shirts, an expensive watch, and had an over-rehearsed confidence. He didn't recognize me at first because I wasn't introduced as the founder. It was ironic that the boy who'd reduced me to a family joke could stand in a room I'd built and not see me. A few days later, he recognized me but didn't show much humility. He continued to treat me with the same old superiority outside the office. He told co-workers stories about his sister who'd tried college and failed and was now doing okay in a minor design role. Then, things started to go wrong for Ethan. He began speaking too confidently in meetings about ideas he hadn't developed. One of our designers mentioned that he'd asked for access to folders outside his project scope, and an analyst flagged irregular budget notations on a vendor reconciliation sheet. One Tuesday morning, he posted on LinkedIn about a breakthrough campaign he claimed to have led. When I saw the images, I realized he'd stolen the concept, visual design, and even parts of the copy from a strategy deck I'd created weeks earlier. Ryan and I started investigating and found that he'd accessed unauthorized folders, downloaded source files, renamed versions, and deleted support documents. He'd also submitted false consulting reimbursements to a shell company that routed money back to his account. A younger staff member showed Ryan screenshots from team chats where Ethan joked about rescuing my half-baked ideas because I didn't understand strategy. This hurt more than the financial theft. It was clear that he still needed me to be beneath him while benefiting from my work. Ryan asked if I wanted to terminate him privately, but I said no. I wanted justice. We spent days gathering evidence, including access logs, timestamps, reimbursement records, and internal witness statements. During this process, I discovered something even more disturbing. While looking through old financial records related to my mother's estate, I found that a custodial education account in my name had been nearly drained during the years Ethan's private tuition, housing, and car costs were covered. It was clear that my father had used his guardianship to take money that was meant for my future. This discovery turned the Christmas dinner from a family event into a reckoning. When I drove to my father's house on Christmas Eve, I knew exactly who everyone thought they were in this story. Ethan was the success, Ava was the proof of his impressive life, my father and Victoria were the proud parents of a thriving son, and I was still the cautionary tale. The house was decorated beautifully when I arrived. Victoria handed me an apron and asked me to help with the appetizers because Ava was coming. I was treated more like unpaid staff than a guest. Ethan arrived late, making an entrance with Ava on his arm. When he saw me, he made that smug comment about me being the family failure. But this time, I was ready. I sent the pre-planned message to Ryan, and within 5 minutes, Ethan's phone rang. He answered, expecting a work-related compliment, but instead, he heard Ryan's calm voice saying, "Ethan, your employment at Zenith is terminated effective immediately. HR and legal will contact you regarding theft of intellectual property, fraudulent reimbursements, and evidence destruction." The room fell silent. My father stood up, and Ethan tried to argue, saying there was a misunderstanding. Ryan told him to check the TV, where I'd mirrored the evidence file. The screen showed all the proof of his theft. And then, Ryan revealed that I was the majority shareholder of Zenith. Ava stepped away from Ethan, my father kept muttering impossible, and Victoria stared at me in shock. Ethan tried to lash out, saying I'd baited him and was jealous because he was the one our father believed in. In that moment, I realized that was the truest thing he'd ever said. His whole identity was built on being more easily believed than me, and now that advantage was gone. The next morning, my father and Victoria came to my place with a folder, a check, and an offer of a property share and early inheritance if I dropped the matter. But buried in the paperwork were references to the accounts linked to my mother's estate and the education fund they'd misused. My aunt, who'd obtained copied bank statements, arrived soon after, and the truth finally came out. I laughed at their offer and tore it in half. I told them they couldn't buy my silence with what they'd already stolen. Ethan and my father tried to smear my reputation online, but I had lawyers and evidence on my side. Cease and desist letters were sent, and the false posts disappeared. Ethan was blacklisted from reputable agencies, Ava left him, and my father and Victoria faced financial reviews. I didn't celebrate publicly. I blocked them from my life. 1 year later, I hosted Christmas in a new home with people who never asked me to shrink for their comfort. We made too much food, laughed too loudly, and spent the afternoon delivering care packages through a local food bank. The lesson I learned after almost 3 decades is that blood doesn't give someone the right to mistreat you. Family doesn't mean ownership. And love that only exists when you're beneath someone isn't real love. If you've ever been cast as the failure in someone else's story, know that sometimes the role isn't yours. It's written by those who need your silence to protect their own lives. Walking away isn't cruel, it's an act of self-respect. Protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's the start of healing. Building a life based on honesty, hard work, and dignity is more important than being the favorite in a dishonest home. I learned this too late to save my childhood, but not too late to save the rest of my life.